In a cozy suburb of Boston, where spring flowers were just beginning to bloom, Mrs. Lee sat nervously in her small apartment's living room, staring at multiple positive pregnancy tests spread out on her coffee table. After 3 years of trying to start a family, she and her husband had finally succeeded through IVF treatment. Their hearts were filled with joy and anticipation for their future as parents. Mrs. Lee, a beloved elementary school teacher known for her warm smile and gentle nature, had always dreamed of having children of her own. Her students often drew pictures of her with a big family, and she kept every single one pinned to her classroom's bulletin board. Now, at 32, her dream was finally coming true. The morning of their 12-week ultrasound appointment arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the windows. Mr. Lee, who worked as a computer programmer, had taken the whole day off to be with his wife for this special moment. They arrived at the hospital early, hands clasped together, sharing excited whispers about whether they might be having a boy or a girl. The ultrasound technician, a friendly woman with kind eyes, welcomed them into the examination room. As she applied the cool gel to Mrs. Lee's stomach, she chatted with them about their hopes and plans. But as she moved the ultrasound wand across Mrs. Lee's belly, her professional smile slowly transformed into a look of surprise. "Just a moment," she said softly. "I need to get Dr. Johnson." The couple exchanged worried glances as they waited. 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. When Dr. Johnson entered, her face was serious but calm. She took the ultrasound wand and began examining the screen carefully, moving it slowly across Mrs. Lee's belly. "Well," Dr. Johnson finally said, "I have some extraordinary news." She turned the screen toward the couple. "You're not just having one baby, you're having 9 babies." The room fell silent. Mr. Lee, who had been standing beside his wife holding her hand, needed to sit down. Mrs. Lee stared at the screen, her mouth open in shock. 9? She whispered, her voice trembling. "How is that possible?" Dr. Johnson explained that while multiple births were more common with IVF treatments, 9 babies, or nonuplets, were extremely rare. In fact, this would be one of the few documented cases in medical history. The next hour was a whirlwind of information. The doctor brought in specialists who explained the risks and challenges ahead. They talked about the need for a specialized medical team, the importance of bed rest, and the high-risk nature of carrying so many babies. Mrs. Lee listened carefully, her hand never leaving her belly. Despite the risks and uncertainties, a sense of wonder began to replace her initial shock. Her dream of having a family was coming true in a way she never imagined. News of the extraordinary pregnancy spread quickly through the hospital. By the end of the day, a team of specialists had already been assembled to monitor Mrs. Lee's case. The couple's small apartment would need to be replaced with a larger home, and their simple nursery plans would need a complete overhaul. That evening, as the Lees sat in their living room trying to process the day's events, Mrs. Lee looked at her husband with tears in her eyes. "I know this isn't what we planned," she said softly, "but somehow it feels right." Mr. Lee squeezed her hand and smiled. "We wanted a family," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Now we're getting a big one all at once." As the sun set outside their window, the couple began making lists of baby names, needed supplies, and all the changes they would need to make. Their simple dream of becoming parents had transformed into an extraordinary journey that would capture the attention of people around the world. But at that moment, they were just 2 people in love, preparing for the biggest adventure of their lives. Little did they know, their story was about to become even more remarkable as their journey held one more surprising twist that nobody could have predicted. As weeks turned into months, the Lees' lives transformed completely. Their cozy apartment was replaced by a special medical suite at Massachusetts General Hospital, where Mrs. Lee would spend the remainder of her pregnancy under constant supervision. The walls of her room quickly filled with ultrasound pictures and cheerful cards from her elementary school students, making the sterile hospital space feel more like home. The medical team assigned to Mrs. Lee's case worked around the clock, taking turns monitoring both mother and babies. Dr. Johnson, who had become like family to the Lees, visited 3 times daily, always bringing a warm smile and reassuring words along with her medical expertise. "Each day these babies stay inside is a victory," she would say, checking the vital signs with careful attention. Mrs. Lee's body changed dramatically as she carried her precious cargo. Her petite frame struggled under the weight of 9 growing babies, making even the simplest tasks challenging. Rolling over in bed became a 2-person job, and breathing comfortably was a constant challenge. Yet through it all, she maintained her gentle spirit and determination. "I never knew I could be this tired and this excited at the same time," she confided to one of her nurses during a particularly difficult night. The nurse, adjusting Mrs. Lee's pillows for the 5th time that hour, smiled knowingly. "You're already showing what an amazing mother you'll be," she replied, "taking care of 9 babies at once, even before they're born." Mr. Lee split his time between the hospital and their home, where he was preparing for their future. He had taken a leave from his programming job and spent his days transforming their new house into a home suitable for their soon-to-be large family. Every evening, he would arrive at the hospital with new pictures of the nursery's progress or stories about the community's overwhelming support. The local news had picked up their story, and the response was heartwarming. Their neighbors organized meal trains and baby supply drives. Mrs. Lee's school arranged for her to teach virtual classes from her hospital bed when she felt up to it, bringing a sense of normalcy to her days. Her students' faces lighting up the computer screen became a highlight of her week. By week 26, the strain on Mrs. Lee's body was becoming critical. The doctors noticed concerning changes in her blood pressure, and the baby's movements were becoming more restricted as they grew. During one tense examination, Dr. Johnson noticed that 3 of the babies were showing signs of distress. "We need to start preparing for an early delivery," Dr. Johnson explained gently to the anxious couple. "We've done remarkably well getting this far, but now we need to think about what's safest for both mom and babies." The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. A team of 27 medical professionals began practicing for the complex delivery, running drills like a well-choreographed dance. Each person had a specific role and responsibility, right down to which baby they would focus on when the time came. Mrs. Lee spent these days talking to her babies, her hands resting on her enormous belly. "Just a little longer," she would whisper, feeling their movements beneath her fingers. "Stay strong for mommy." Mr. Lee would often join her in these quiet moments, adding his own words of encouragement to their unborn children. The situation reached a critical point at week 28. During a routine morning check, the monitors began showing irregular patterns. Mrs. Lee's blood pressure had spiked dangerously high, and several of the babies were showing signs of distress. Dr. Johnson made the call. It was time. "We're going to meet your babies today," she announced, her calm voice masking the urgency of the situation. The room erupted into controlled chaos as the medical team sprang into action. Mr. Lee quickly donned surgical scrubs, his hands trembling as he tied the mask behind his head. As they wheeled Mrs. Lee toward the operating room, she squeezed her husband's hand tightly. Despite her fear, there was a sense of peace about her. "We're ready," she said softly, looking into his eyes. "Whatever happens, we're ready." The operating room doors swung open, revealing the assembled team of medical professionals, all prepared for one of the most complex deliveries they would ever perform. Little did they know, the biggest surprise of this remarkable journey was still to come. The operating room buzzed with focused energy as the medical team took their positions. The room had been specially prepared, with 9 infant care stations arranged in a semicircle, each staffed by a dedicated team of nurses and pediatricians. The soft beeping of monitors filled the air as Mrs. Lee was carefully positioned on the operating table. Mr. Lee sat near his wife's head, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Despite his own nervousness, he remained strong for her, gently wiping tears from her eyes as the anesthesiologist prepared her for the surgery. "You're doing amazing," he said softly, his voice full of love and admiration. Dr. Johnson stood at the operating table, her experienced hands steady as she prepared to begin. "Everyone ready?" she called out, looking around the room at her assembled team. 27 heads nodded in unison. The atmosphere was tense but focused, like musicians preparing for an intricate symphony. "We're starting now," Dr. Johnson announced clearly. The first incision was made at exactly 8:42 a.m. The room fell into a rhythm of precise movements and clear, calm communications. Each team member knew their role perfectly, moving with practiced efficiency as they prepared to welcome 9 tiny lives into the world. At 8:56 a.m., the first baby emerged, a tiny girl weighing just over 2 pounds. Her cry, though small, filled the room with joy. A nurse quickly whisked her to the first care station, where her team immediately began ensuring her health and stability. "Baby A is stable," called out the pediatrician, bringing smiles to everyone's faces behind their surgical masks. One by one, more babies followed. Each arrival was met with the same careful attention and expertise. Some cried right away, while others needed gentle encouragement to take their first breaths. Mr. Lee counted quietly along with each birth, tears streaming down his face as he watched his children enter the world. 4 girls and 3 boys so far, announced one of the nurses, her voice filled with excitement. Mrs. Lee squeezed her husband's hand tighter with each announcement, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation as her precious cargo was carefully delivered. The 8th baby, another boy, arrived at 9:47 a.m. He was the smallest so far, but his cry was surprisingly strong. The team worked with incredible coordination, each baby receiving immediate care while Dr. Johnson continued her precise work. At 10:03 a.m., the 9th baby, a girl, made her appearance. "All 9 are here and stable," called out the head nurse, her voice triumphant. The room filled with a sense of accomplishment and relief. Mrs. Lee closed her eyes in gratitude, exhausted but overjoyed. Dr. Johnson began the final steps of the surgery, her experienced hands moving methodically to ensure everything was as it should be. That's when she noticed something unusual on the ultrasound monitor, still tracking Mrs. Lee's womb. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp with surprise. "There's still movement." The room, which had been buzzing with the controlled chaos of caring for 9 newborns, suddenly grew quiet. Dr. Johnson squinted at the monitor, moving the ultrasound wand carefully. "I'm seeing something else," she announced, her voice calm but filled with disbelief. "Something we missed in all our scans." Mr. Lee stood up straighter, his eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Lee gripped his hand tighter, her heart racing. The medical team exchanged glances of surprise and confusion. They had prepared for 9 babies. All the scans had shown 9. The equipment was set up for 9. The team was organized for 9. But clearly there was something else. "Get another pediatric team in here," Dr. Johnson commanded, her voice steady despite the unexpected turn of events. "We're not quite finished." As one of the nurses rushed to make the call, the rest of the team continued their work with the 9 babies, each one growing stronger by the minute in their specialized care stations. The monitor continued to show movement, clear and undeniable. Whatever was still inside was active and substantial. The room held its breath, waiting to see what this final surprise would be. After months of preparation, after successfully delivering 9 tiny babies, they were about to face something nobody had anticipated. As another pediatric team rushed into the operating room, Dr. Johnson prepared to investigate this last mystery. The story of the remarkable multiple birth was about to take an even more extraordinary turn. The tension in the operating room grew as Dr. Johnson carefully began to investigate the mysterious movement on the ultrasound screen. The soft cries of the 9 newborns created a gentle backdrop to the intense concentration of the medical team. Mr. Lee stood frozen, his eyes darting between his wife's face and the determined expression of Dr. Johnson. "The imaging shows something substantial," Dr. Johnson announced, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's about the size of the other babies, but the structure seems different." She moved the ultrasound wand slowly, capturing different angles of the unidentified mass. The newly arrived pediatric team stood ready, their station prepared for what everyone assumed would be a 10th baby. But as Dr. Johnson worked, she began to notice unusual patterns on the screen. "This is unlike anything I've seen in my 20 years of delivering babies," she said, her voice filled with professional curiosity. Mrs. Lee, though exhausted from the delivery of 9 babies, remained alert and concerned. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her husband squeezed her hand reassuringly, though his own heart was racing with worry. As Dr. Johnson carefully continued the procedure, she discovered something that would make medical history. What they had detected wasn't a 10th baby at all. It was a rare type of growth called a teratoma, but one more complex than any they had encountered before. "It's a benign tumor," Dr. Johnson explained calmly, not wanting to alarm the parents. "But it's fascinating because it has developed alongside your babies throughout the pregnancy. This is incredibly rare. She worked methodically to remove the growth, her experienced hands moving with precise care. The tumor, once removed, amazed the entire medical team. Unlike typical growths, this teratoma had developed in an extraordinary way. It contained fully formed teeth, small patches of hair, and even tiny sections of tissue that resembled rudimentary organs. This explained why it had been so difficult to distinguish from a fetus during the pregnancy scans. One of the senior nurses, who had been working in labor and delivery for over 30 years, shook her head in amazement. "In all my years, I've never seen anything quite like this," she whispered to her colleague. No wonder it looked like another baby on the ultrasounds. The pediatric team, no longer needed for a 10th baby, assisted their colleagues in caring for the 9 healthy newborns. Each tiny baby was doing remarkably well, their vital signs strong despite their early arrival. The medical staff worked efficiently to ensure each child was stable and comfortable in their specialized incubator. Mr. Lee, who had been holding his breath throughout this final part of the surgery, finally exhaled deeply. "So everything is okay?" he asked, looking at Dr. Johnson with hopeful eyes. "All our babies are healthy." Dr. Johnson smiled warmly as she completed the final stages of the surgery. "Yes," she assured him. "Your 9 beautiful babies are all doing wonderfully. And this unexpected discovery, while surprising, is completely benign. Your wife did amazingly well." Mrs. Lay, still processing everything that had happened, managed a tired smile. 10 surprises were hiding in there all along, she said softly, even if one wasn't quite what we expected. The medical team began their post-operative procedures, carefully monitoring Mrs. Lee's recovery. The room buzzed with excited whispers as news of the unusual discovery spread through the hospital. Already, senior doctors were discussing the scientific significance of finding such a complex teratoma in a multiple pregnancy. As the nurses cleaned and arranged the babies in their incubators, Mr. Lee went from one to another, marveling at each tiny face. "They're perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All 9 of them are absolutely perfect." The discovery would soon make headlines around the world, not just for the rare occurrence of nonuplets, but for the extraordinary tumor that had developed alongside them. Medical journals would request detailed reports, and researchers would study the case extensively. But for now, in that operating room, it was simply a story of family, of 9 tiny miracles, and one remarkable reminder of how wonderfully mysterious the human body could be. As the day drew to a close, the medical team prepared to move the babies to the neonatal intensive care unit. The unusual tumor was carefully preserved for further study, but the focus remained firmly on the health and care of the 9 precious newborns who had just entered the world. In the days following the remarkable delivery, the hospital buzzed with excitement as news of the extraordinary case spread through the medical community. Doctors and researchers from around the world began reaching out to learn more about the unique combination of nonuplets and the mysterious tumor that had developed alongside them. Dr. Johnson sat in her office late one evening, carefully reviewing the detailed scans from Mrs. Lee's pregnancy. She spread out the ultrasound images across her desk, trying to understand how the tumor had remained undetected among the 9 babies. "It's like finding a snowflake in a snowstorm," she explained to a colleague who had stopped by to discuss the case. "The tumor developed in such a way that it perfectly mimicked fetal tissue on our scans." Down in the hospital's research laboratory, a team of specialists gathered around a microscope, examining tissue samples from the tumor. "Look at this," one researcher called out, adjusting the microscope's focus. "The cellular structure is fascinating. It's almost as if it was trying to develop like a baby, but couldn't quite get the instructions right." The case sparked intense interest from medical institutions worldwide. Leading researchers from top hospitals requested access to the data, believing this unique occurrence could provide valuable insights into fetal development and tumor growth. Each new examination revealed more surprises about how the tumor had formed and grown alongside the healthy babies. Meanwhile, in the neonatal intensive care unit, life continued with its own rhythm. Mrs. Lee, now recovering in a private room nearby, spent every possible moment with her 9 tiny babies. She would sit between their incubators, reading stories and singing soft lullabies, while medical students and researchers quietly observed and took notes from a respectful distance. It's strange to think that our family's story might help doctors understand something new, Mrs. Lee said to her husband one afternoon as they watched their babies sleeping peacefully in their incubators. All we wanted was a child, and now we're part of medical history. Mr. Lee nodded, gently touching one of the incubators where their smallest baby was stretching tiny fingers. Our children are teaching doctors before they can even speak, he said with a proud smile. The hospital organized a special conference where Dr. Johnson and her team presented their initial findings to an audience of fascinated medical professionals. They explained how the tumor had developed unique characteristics that made it blend in perfectly with the ultrasound images of the actual babies. This case challenges what we know about multiple pregnancies and fetal development, Dr. Johnson explained to the crowded auditorium. The tumor seems to have responded to the same growth signals as the babies, developing alongside them in a way we've never seen before. Questions poured in from doctors around the world. How had the tumor affected the development of the 9 babies? What implications did this have for future multiple pregnancy screenings? Could this help them understand more about how babies develop in the womb? Back in the NICU, none of these big questions seemed to matter to the tiny babies who grew stronger each day. The nurses had grown attached to the little ones, marveling at how each had developed their own personality already. "This one's always awake, watching everything," one nurse would say. "And this little one here, she's our peaceful dreamer." Research teams worked tirelessly to document every aspect of the case. They created detailed 3D models of how the babies and tumor had been positioned, studied countless blood samples, and analyzed every scan from Mrs. Lee's pregnancy. Each new piece of information helped build a clearer picture of this medical mystery. One evening, as the sun set outside the hospital windows, a young medical student sat with Mrs. Lee, asking her questions about her pregnancy experience. "Did you ever feel like something was different?" the student asked gently. Mrs. Lee thought for a moment, her hand resting on one of the incubators. "I just felt blessed," she replied with a soft smile. "Every kick, every movement was precious to me. I never knew one of those movements wasn't a baby. I loved them all the same." The medical journals clamored to publish articles about the case. Researchers began developing new protocols for screening multiple pregnancies, inspired by the lessons learned from Mrs. Lee's experience. But perhaps the most valuable lesson wasn't about medical science at all. It was about the remarkable adaptability of the human body and the boundless capacity of a mother's love. As the days passed, the hospital continued its dual mission, caring for 9 tiny babies while unraveling the mysteries of their unique birth story. Each day brought new discoveries, new questions, and new reasons to marvel at the complexities of human development. Through it all, the Lee family remained at the heart of the story, not just as subjects of medical study, but as a living reminder of life's endless capacity to surprise and amaze. The neonatal intensive care unit became a second home for the Lee family over the next 3 months. The room that housed their 9 tiny miracles was filled with the gentle humming of incubators and the soft beeping of monitors. Each day brought new challenges and tiny victories as both babies and mother grew stronger. Mrs. Lee's recovery was slower than usual, her body working hard to heal from the massive strain it had endured. The nurses watched in admiration as she pushed through her own discomfort, determined to be there for her babies. Despite doctors' orders to rest, she would sit for hours in a comfortable rocking chair between the incubators, talking softly to each child. "You need to take care of yourself too," one kind-hearted nurse often reminded her, bringing extra pillows to make her more comfortable. "These little ones need their mama healthy and strong." But Mrs. Lee would just smile, her eyes never leaving the tiny faces of her children. "Being here with them gives me more strength than any medicine," she would reply. Mr. Lee juggled his time between the hospital and preparing their home for the baby's eventual arrival. The local community had rallied around the family in amazing ways. Neighbors helped convert their living room into a temporary nursery, complete with 9 bassinets arranged in a circle. Others organized meal trains and volunteer schedules to help once the babies came home. In the NICU, each baby developed their own personality. The nurses began calling them by special nicknames based on their traits. The firstborn, slightly bigger than her siblings, became known as Big Sister. Another, who always stretched her tiny arms above her head, was dubbed Little Dancer. Each baby's progress was celebrated by the entire hospital staff. "Look who's breathing all on their own today," a nurse would announce excitedly as one by one the babies were gradually taken off breathing support. Each milestone was recorded in a special journal that Mrs. Lee kept by her side, filling it with notes about every achievement, no matter how small. The baby's weight gain became a daily source of joy and anticipation. The nurses would carefully weigh each infant, calling out the numbers while Mrs. Lee recorded them in her journal. "Up 30 grams." They would cheer, treating each small increase like a major victory. Physical therapists visited regularly, showing the parents special exercises to help the babies develop. Mrs. Lee learned to massage each tiny body, singing soft lullabies as she worked. The sound of her voice would often calm even the fussiest baby, leading the nurses to joke that she had a magic touch. Some days were harder than others. There were scares when monitors would suddenly beep with warnings, sending medical staff rushing to check on a baby. But each time, the little ones proved their strength, bouncing back from every setback. "They're fighters, just like their mother," Dr. Johnson would say during her daily rounds. The hospital staff nicknamed Mrs. Lee Supermom for her incredible dedication. Despite her own recovery, she learned to care for multiple babies at once, mastering the art of feeding 2 babies while soothing a third with her voice. She remembered each baby's special needs and preferences, impressing even the most experienced nurses. Mr. Lee proved equally dedicated, arriving each morning with fresh determination. He learned to change tiny diapers with expert precision and could soon tell which baby was crying just by the sound. During his evening visits after work, he would read stories to all 9, his gentle voice carrying through the NICU. As the weeks passed, the babies grew stronger. Their time on breathing support decreased, and they began taking more feeds by mouth. The nurses started teaching the parents how to bathe the babies, a task that required careful coordination and plenty of helping hands. The parents learned to work as a seamless team, developing their own system for caring for multiple babies. They created color-coded charts to track feeding schedules and diaper changes. Each baby had their own color, making it easier to keep track of who needed what and when. Visitors were strictly limited due to the baby's fragile immune systems, but the Lee's elementary school arranged a special video call. Mrs. Lee's students sang songs to the babies and showed off artwork they had made for their teacher's new family. The joy on Mrs. Lee's face during that call brought tears to the nurse's eyes. By the end of 3 months, the transformation was remarkable. The babies, once so tiny and fragile, had nearly doubled in size. Their personalities became more distinct each day, and their cries grew stronger. The medical team began discussing discharge plans, though the thought of caring for 9 babies at home was both exciting and terrifying for the new parents. Through it all, the unusual tumor that had been discovered during their birth remained a subject of study, but it took a backseat to the daily miracle of watching 9 tiny lives grow and thrive. The Lee family's story had captured hearts worldwide, but in the NICU, they were simply a family learning to navigate their new normal one day at a time. 1 year had passed since the remarkable birth that had captured the world's attention. The Lee family's modest suburban home had transformed into a wonderfully organized baby paradise, filled with the joyful sounds of 9 thriving infants. The living room, once quiet and simple, now buzzed with activity as 9 curious babies explored their world. The morning routine in the Lee household was like a carefully choreographed dance. Mrs. Lee, who had discovered reserves of energy she never knew she possessed, moved efficiently between babies as she prepared their morning bottles. The kitchen counter displayed a rainbow of colored bottles, each marked with a different symbol to identify which baby it belonged to. "It's amazing how far we've come," Mr. Lee said one morning as he helped feed 3 babies at once using a special pillow system they had developed. The babies, now plump and healthy, were nothing like the tiny, fragile infants they had brought home from the hospital. Each had developed their own distinct personality, making their parents smile with their unique quirks and habits. The first baby to crawl had inspired her siblings, and within weeks, the house had become a maze of baby-proofed areas and soft play spaces. "It's like watching a tiny army on the move," Grandmother Lee would laugh during her daily visits to help. The family had developed an incredible support system, with relatives, friends, and community members all playing their part. Their story had touched people around the world, and the family occasionally shared updates on a special blog, careful to protect their children's privacy by allowing well-wishers to celebrate their progress. Pictures of 9 pairs of tiny shoes lined up or 9 little hands reaching for a toy brought joy to thousands of followers. The local community continued to embrace the family. Neighbors took turns helping with laundry, a never-ending task with 9 babies. The grocery store kept a special list of the family's regular orders, delivering supplies weekly. Even the local fire station had visited to ensure the house was properly equipped with all necessary safety measures for such a unique family. Dr. Johnson still visited regularly, both as their doctor and as someone who had become like family. During one checkup, she marveled at how well all 9 babies were developing. Each one is meeting their milestones beautifully, she noted, watching as the babies played on their colorful mat. The preserved tumor specimen from their birth had led to several medical breakthroughs, but Dr. Johnson took more joy in seeing these 9 healthy children thriving. The baby's first birthday celebration was a testament to the joy they had brought to their community. The local park was decorated with 9 of everything, 9 small cakes, 9 number 1 candles, 9 tiny party hats. Friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate not just the babies, but the incredible journey of their family. Mrs. Lee had returned to teaching part-time, bringing the babies to school one day to meet her students. The children were fascinated by the 9 little ones, especially when told about their unusual birth story. "Your babies are like a science lesson and a miracle all in one student had said, making everyone smile. The house ran with military precision, yet was filled with warmth and laughter. Color-coded charts covered the walls, tracking feeding schedules, nap times, and developmental milestones. Each baby had their own daily journal, where parents and helpers noted their activities and achievements. "We might be organized," Mrs. Lee would say, "but we never forget to just enjoy each moment." Every evening, after the babies were settled in their cribs, Mr. and Mrs. Lee would sit together, often too tired to speak, but grateful for another day with their miraculous family. They had transformed their 3-bedroom house into an efficient baby care facility with rooms arranged to make nighttime care as smooth as possible. The medical world hadn't forgotten their unique case. The tumor that had been discovered during the birth was still being studied, providing valuable insights into fetal development. Occasionally, medical students would visit to learn about the case, always amazed by the happy, healthy babies who had shared the womb with such an unusual companion. Their story had been featured in medical textbooks and journals, but the Lee family focused on the simple joys of watching their children grow. Each smile, each new word, each wobbly first step was celebrated. The challenges of raising 9 babies were constant, but so were the rewards. As the sun set on another busy day, Mrs. Lee sat in the nursery's rocking chair, surrounded by 9 cribs arranged in a circle. She hummed softly, watching as her precious little ones drifted off to sleep. The room that had once seemed impossibly full of equipment and monitors was now a peaceful sanctuary, filled with the gentle breathing of 9 miracle babies. "Every day is an adventure," she whispered to her husband as they tiptoed out of the room. The wall behind them was covered with photos documenting their incredible journey, from the first ultrasound showing 9 tiny hearts beating to the latest family portrait showing 9 beaming babies. Their story had become more than just a medical miracle. It was a testament to love, determination, and the amazing possibilities of life.